"We can split up if you want, but I want to stay with our son," John said firmly after scolding me. He seemed satisfied as he took a deep breath. As I thought about how to respond, our son, who had been standing by, stepped forward. "Dad, if you don't know, let me tell you," he said, pointing at his father's mistress. Our son's words made me smile mischievously. "My name's Jennifer. I'm 42 years old and work as a freelance artist. I've been married for 15 years and have an 8th grade son. Since we got married, John has struggled to hold down a job. So I've been the main breadwinner, juggling work, household chores, and raising our child. I've had to work from home because John's jobs were unstable, leaving me to care for our son. It was tough at first, but now I have a stable income from illustrating educational materials, thanks to referrals from previous clients. With David getting older, I can work from home and go out for projects a few times a week. So the three of us are living together peacefully, but there's something on my mind about John. Despite my steady income, he doesn't seem motivated to find a new job and seems lost. I'm concerned about him being 44 and not having a clear direction. He rarely works full-time, so he should have free time, but he doesn't help much around the house or with our son David. This has been the pattern since we got married, so I've stopped expecting much from him. He doesn't seem interested in David, who's going through tough teenage years, which bothers me. David isn't very talkative, but he sometimes helps with chores without me asking. Maybe he's learned from seeing me manage work and chores since he was young. David has matured a lot, but John hasn't. Lately, John's been coming home late more often, adding to my unease and frustration. It's natural to feel suspicious. Even on days when he's not supposed to work, he claims to have work-related reasons to leave. But I doubt he's secretly job hunting without telling us. There are some things that make me feel suspicious. Recently, John hasn't been spending much time looking after David. He's taken a sudden interest in driving him to and from his basketball club, even though David is just in 8th grade. We have a rule in our household to always drop off and pick up due to safety concerns in today's world. I've always had to fit this around my work schedule, but John started offering to do it lately. While I appreciate the help, something didn't sit right with me. My suspicion grew when I happened to pass by the basketball club one day. I decided to take a different route home after shopping and saw John there, despite him saying he'd be late due to work out of town. He was chatting happily with a woman who seemed to work at the facility. As I stood there, the woman noticed me and asked if I was David's mom. I awkwardly acknowledged her, realizing I hadn't remembered all the staff's faces. I chatted with her briefly, ignoring my husband's tense demeanor. The woman introduced herself as Jessica, but I found it odd that she didn't mention her role with my child. Seeing my confusion, John seemed eager to end their conversation. On the way home, there was an uncomfortable silence between us, and it felt like he was intentionally avoiding me. Despite his seemingly cheerful conversation with Jessica earlier, he walked beside me with his head down, avoiding eye contact. I could sense that something wasn't right. His recent late returns, sudden interest in doing drop-offs and pickups, and strange behavior after being seen with Jessica made me suspect that there was more to their relationship. Could he be having an affair with her? Deep down, I had felt a shift ever since he started taking over the transportation duties. He had become distant from me. That day, when our son returned from the basketball club, I casually asked about his father's behavior, but all I got was a dismissive, "I don't know." It seemed our son was frustrated with his dad's insistence on driving him every day. Forcing our reluctant son to go along with it didn't sit well with me. I had been harboring suspicions for a while now, and it seemed they were about to be confirmed. I was just passing by, so I thought I'd drop in. "David, how are you feeling?" Jessica said as she entered our home. "Thank you for coming all this way, Jessica." "Now please, have some coffee," I replied politely. Jessica, whom I hadn't suspected of being involved with my husband, started finding reasons to visit our home more frequently. She would mention our son occasionally, but it was clear her real motive was something else. Her visits always coincided with the times my husband was home, never when my son or I were alone. Watching them chat cheerfully in the living room confirmed my suspicions of John's infidelity. About a month after I first noticed his odd behavior, he began coming home later and later, sometimes disappearing for days at a time. When I confronted him about sneaking in late one night, he joked about it, but his reaction changed when I mentioned cheating. He snapped at me, telling me to mind my own business and focus on my work. His irritation was evident as he stormed out of the room. I was angry that he acted as if he was doing everything when, in reality, he left all the housework and parenting to me. "What's wrong, Mom?" David, who had been witnessing our arguments, spoke up unexpectedly. "Oh, it's nothing. Why are you still awake?" I deflected, but David seemed hesitant before finally opening up about his suspicions regarding Jessica, whom he believed might be involved with his father. He found her clingy and irritating, especially since she would come to our house uninvited. It was a relief to know that I wasn't alone in disliking her presence, but the situation was far from resolved. When I returned home from a client meeting, I heard laughter coming from the living room. It was John and Jessica. David must have stayed in his room as he didn't join them. As I entered the living room, both John and Jessica turned to look at me. John appeared uncomfortable as usual, while Jessica greeted me with a confident smile. "Welcome back, David's mom," Jessica greeted me as I bumped into John, who then invited me inside. I couldn't shake off the unease I felt about Jessica addressing my husband by his name. "Oh, we seem to run into each other often, don't we? Isn't work keeping you busy?" I retorted with a touch of sarcasm. Jessica replied with a smug expression. "Well, part of my job involves visiting homes." I wanted to lash out at her for being so presumptuous. "What part of your job involves critiquing people's homes?" I wanted to ask, but I held my tongue. Instead, she commented on the cozy atmosphere of our house, insinuating that it wasn't kept very clean. Her sly grin made it clear she was enjoying pointing out my shortcomings. My husband didn't defend me. Instead, he chuckled along with Jessica, even adding that I should do better with the housework since I'm always home. It frustrated me that I was the only one being mocked. Feeling overwhelmed, I quickly retreated to the bedroom, still holding my belongings, overcome with frustration, sadness, and embarrassment. I worried that Jessica might replace me in my family eventually. If she wasn't involved with my son's basketball team, I might have confronted her. But I hesitated for my son's sake. Despite my concerns, my husband and Jessica continued their rendezvous, openly displaying their relationship while I remained silent. People told me they often met under the guise of discussing our son's education. Determined to uncover the truth, I searched for evidence during my husband's absences and discovered plenty of proof of his infidelity. Despite his claims that we couldn't afford gifts for birthdays or anniversaries, I found receipts for motel stays, lavish dinners, and expensive jewelry in his coat pocket. I even found receipts for places he said were too expensive for us to visit. It pained me to think he spent money on his mistress, but not on his wife. Despite my hurt, I stayed composed and continued gathering evidence. Divorce crossed my mind, but I wanted to wait until David graduated high school. Nevertheless, I resolved to gather as much evidence as possible to protect myself. I wondered where my husband got the money for his affair. Even if he used his entire salary, it would be challenging to sustain. Lost in thought, I suddenly remembered our college fund account for David. A wave of dread washed over me as I checked its transactions, revealing large withdrawals over the past few months. I had opened the savings account specifically to secure my son's education funds just in case. It had been a while since I last checked it, and I was shocked to discover that the balance had significantly decreased. Despite meticulously managing our credit card usage and monthly bills, I had neglected to monitor the savings account regularly. The realization hit me hard, and I struggled to steady my trembling hands. The money he spent on his affair came from the savings I had diligently set aside for our son. At that moment, I no longer cared who he was having an affair with. What I couldn't forgive was that he had used the money meant for our child's future for his own selfish desires. His betrayal against me as his wife paled in comparison to the betrayal against our son. Suppressing my boiling anger, I resolved to continue pretending that everything was normal. I didn't want our son, who was at such an impressionable age, to catch on. I chose to shoulder all the problems and worries alone, not wanting to burden our hardworking son with unnecessary stress. However, the strain began to take its toll on me, leading to small mistakes in my household chores and work. Even Mrs. Smith, a longtime client, noticed my worn-out state and expressed her concern. While I struggled, my husband seemed to be enjoying himself with his mistress more than ever. Without my interference, he appeared more relaxed. Sooner or later, our son David would inevitably become aware of the issues surrounding our family. Recognizing my subdued demeanor, David silently offered to help with the laundry, expressing his understanding of the situation. His quiet support warmed my heart and fueled my anger toward the traitor who had jeopardized the money I had saved for our son. There had to be consequences for his betrayal. I contemplated reaching out to someone who had offered to support me, clenching my fists as I swore vengeance against my husband and his mistress. One evening, my husband abruptly announced that he would be away for almost a week due to work. He insisted that he was attending a training program in another state, but I had my doubts about the truthfulness of his explanation. The restaurant chain where he worked only had locations within our state, and there were no offices or branches elsewhere. I distinctly remembered him boasting about this perk when he first took the job, emphasizing that there would be no need to relocate out of state. While my son and I engaged in conversation with him, we both harbored skepticism about his story. My son casually mentioned, one of the staff members from my club is also off work for a week around this time. I don't know if she's going on vacation, but it seems unusual. Going on a week-long vacation requires some cash. Despite our casual tone, my husband appeared startled by our observation. Until then, he had been proudly discussing the rigorous training program he was supposedly attending, but suddenly fell silent and glanced down at his smartphone anxiously. Ever since I became certain of my husband's infidelity, I had been monitoring both him and Jessica closely. I even hired a private investigator who confirmed that Jessica, who worked at the basketball facility, was also taking a week off. I had known all along that my husband's supposed business trip was merely a cover for a romantic getaway with Jessica. While I could have caught him red-handed, I had other plans in mind. I had been scheming since learning of my husband's intentions to travel with Jessica. Naturally, I didn't intend to proceed without my son's agreement, but fortunately, he was on board with my plan. On the day of their trip, I bid farewell to my eager husband, and then my son and I set about cleaning the house. With the assistance of some relatives who came over, we also began packing. Our plan was to relocate while my husband was away and stay elsewhere until we found a new home, temporarily staying with some accommodating relatives. Upon learning of our situation, our relatives, enraged by my husband's actions yet concerned for David, graciously offered us a place to stay. Additionally, I safeguarded our savings by transferring all remaining funds to my personal account, ensuring that my husband couldn't access it. As we made preparations, I noticed my husband's belongings were still in the house as we prepared to leave. It didn't feel right to abandon his things, so after some consideration, I decided to send them to a specific location. With Mrs. Smith's approval, I arranged for a pickup service to collect the boxes. Surveying the neat and tidy house my son and I now shared, we exchanged a satisfied smile. A few days after we had relocated, my phone suddenly rang, startling me in the midst of our temporary stay at my relative's place. Seeing my husband's name on the caller ID, I couldn't help but sigh involuntarily. "Hello, Jennifer," he greeted me. "Hey, what's going on?" "It's the middle of the day," I responded, already anticipating his request. "Actually, during my training, I ran out of money. Can you transfer some funds to my account?" His voice sounded panicked, confirming my suspicions. No wonder our savings account was drained. He couldn't access any funds. His desperation was palpable, more so than usual. Was it because he didn't want to appear inadequate in front of Jessica? Feeling exasperated, I declined his plea, almost amused by his predicament. "Why don't you use the account you always dip into?" There should still be plenty left, I suggested with a smirk. After a brief silence, he erupted into angry shouts. Are you okay with me being broke? He yelled, but I refused to entertain his outburst. Your training will be over soon. You'll manage without money, I countered, goading him further. Suddenly, a frantic female voice could be heard in the background. It was the moment I had been waiting for. Surprised by Jessica's voice in the background, my husband abruptly ended the call. With everything falling into place, the next day my son and I headed to a specific location. A grand mansion with immaculate gardens, clearly the residence of affluent individuals. As if on cue, we found my husband and his mistress in a room. My husband looked terrified as he sat on the floor, offering apologies to someone. That someone, with a stern expression, was Mrs. Smith, a longtime client of mine and the principal of the middle school attended by my son David. Over the years, we had developed a close bond, sharing personal troubles and trusting each other implicitly. My husband's actions have caused trouble, and I must apologize. I began taking responsibility for my husband's misconduct. It turned out that Jessica, who had been on a trip with my husband, was confronted by her parents about a package she had received at home. She had no choice but to return home immediately. And naturally, she insisted that my husband accompany her. Hearing Mrs. Smith's words, my husband trembled with fear. Mrs. Smith had been deeply concerned about my declining health since learning of John's affair. When I finally confided in her about the affair, and she discovered that her daughter was the mistress, she was devastated. However, Mrs. Smith was determined to make amends for her daughter's actions and had been cooperating with me ever since. She offered a heartfelt apology, gesturing toward the piles of boxes, and sternly reprimanded her daughter. You should be ashamed of yourself for coveting what isn't yours, she scolded. Jessica's attempts to defend herself fell flat, claiming it was all a misunderstanding and questioning the sanity of the sender of numerous packages to their house. Turning to my husband, Jessica pleaded for support, but he remained silent under my disapproving gaze. With a panicked expression, Jessica confessed that she had no idea her mother worked with me and never intended for her strict mother to discover her affair with a married man. Mrs. Smith is a teacher, and she has very strict rules about what's right and wrong. She's not likely to forgive her daughter for what she did, but I didn't feel sorry for Jessica at all. I want you to say sorry, Mrs. Smith said firmly. My daughter has to make up for what she did. Even if it takes her whole life, she has to do the right thing. Why is this happening to me? Jessica cried, but I didn't pay attention to her. Instead, I looked at my husband, who was standing silently beside her. Don't you have something to say? I asked him, feeling angry. Then, unexpectedly, David, who was standing behind me, spoke up. Jessica isn't just a regular worker. She's only an intern at the club, David said firmly. And don't you dare try to be friendly with me again. Your flirting with other men is gross. It turned out that Jessica wasn't even officially hired at the club. My husband always thought Jessica was very skilled and passionate about working with students, which I found funny. It turned out they both had secrets. Seeing Jessica's shocked face, I decided to give her some advice before I left. Did you know that I pay for everything? The rent, our living expenses, and even David's school fees. I told her. John has been doing odd jobs for years, but you wouldn't know that. Hey, hold on a minute. John tried to interrupt, but it was too late. Jessica was so surprised by what I said that she collapsed on the spot. It turned out John had been pretending to have plenty of money, hiding the fact that I was the one supporting our family. He wanted to impress Jessica, so he made it seem like he had everything under control. He made me look lazy and useless in front of her. Mrs. Smith was devastated when she found out the truth about John and Jessica. When David and I happily returned home, we saw John looking defeated, with Jessica and all their things. Mrs. Smith had kicked him out. Months passed since we moved. Following Mrs. Smith's advice, I hired a good lawyer to handle my divorce. Everything went smoothly, and I felt relieved. I even found out that the savings I had put aside for David's education could be used as child support. As for Jessica, rumors spread quickly at the basketball club about her affair with a parent. She lost her job and tried to get help from her parents, but Mrs. Smith wasn't willing to help. Jessica ended up alone and confused. She left John because he didn't have any money, and now he's trying to make things right. But David and I aren't interested. Mrs. Smith felt guilty for what her daughter did to our family. I reassured her and thanked her for helping me find a new job. Life has been good with just David and me, and I'm proud to be David's mom. David's simple words brought tears to my eyes. I want to keep working as an illustrator, but most importantly, I want to be the best mom I can be for David.